Good day. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Lately, especially over the recent days, we've seen too many emotional statements in the media regarding the situation in Syria, so I thought it would be important to give our view on the current situation. The situation is becoming more and more alarming. There's an impression that the country is at the brink of large-scale civilian conflict. We're also concerned with the reaction at what's going on in Syria on behalf of a number of outside players that openly support armed opposition groups, and on the other hand demand from the international community to take decisive steps to change regime in the Arab Syrian Republic. For the first time since the beginning of the crisis, we've seen that the question of potential foreign intervention is raised emotionally and persistently. As a result, lives are still lost. Largely it is happening because players from the outside are pushing to opposition towards defining any compromise. They continue in military actions, and they have hopes that Libyan scenario might be repeated. It is alarming. Our position remains unchanged. We shall not sanction within the UN Security Council use of force. Consequences for the entire Middle East region would have been dire. I hope we've all had enough of implications, the war in Iraq, democratization efforts in Libya, in Mali, in Libya itself. It is not clear when the elections that have been rescheduled more than once will finally take place. And I hope none of us needs to create grave problems in Lebanon. We're seeing first signs of problems, and other regions of the world would also be affected by catastrophic implications should force scenario be used to resolve Syrian problems that might result a huge arch of instability from Mediterranean to the Gulf. And I hope that wise people understand that. They also hopefully understand that there's real threat of Sunni Shia opposition in the region. I'm convinced that it is not the future we're all seeking for the region, that is oftentimes referred to as the Greater Middle East. We believe, we all want that peoples of the region that is of great geopolitical importance, live peacefully and decide on their own political destiny. We've said more than once, and we reiterate that once again, that any government of any country bears the bulk of responsibility for the events that take place on the territory of the state, and Syrian authorities are no exception. We've said that more than once, openly pointed out numerous mistakes that were committed by Syrian authorities in the course of events that started unfolding over 12 months ago. Nonetheless, when we get news about new hostilities, at the moment, such acts of violence are committed in Syria almost daily since the situation has been destabilized. Immediately we hear calls on behalf of most international media to blame it on Syrian authorities, to put the entire blame on them. Like I said, they are bearing the bulk of responsibility for everything that's happening on the territory, since the government of a country is always responsible for ensuring respect of rights of citizens. But I don't think that anyone could imagine 12 months ago that crimes like we're seeing today would be committed in Syria. And I'm convinced that the problem is not just the regime, the authorities of Syria. The situation where tragedies in Hula, Kube were possible. Other acts of violence, including Damascus, Aleppo, and other terrorist acts that were condemned by the UN Security Council, all of that became the result of confrontation that was and is fueled by outside forces. I'm referring first and foremost to the moral support to the armed opposition, supplying with funding, arms, or providing mercenaries that are being shipped to Syria. Media, by the way, that are still guided in their assessment by information that they get from notorious and politically engaged local channels. Oftentimes they portray those acts as heroic acts of protectors of human rights. I would like to, however, give you a number of facts that describe the true nature of such acts. Recently, a building called in Damascus in Tijar was shelled. Russian experts lived there. Grenade launcher was used. Grenade hit the wall of the first floor. The building was damaged. Luckily, no lives were lost. It is not the only case of shooting of our militaries. Last autumn, Stronti's gas office in Homs was attacked, and just today on the west of Damascus, a bus with Russian experts was also shot at. Just a few days ago, media informed about clashes in the vicinity of Al-Haifa in the Taki province. The rebels of the Syrian Free Army tried to seize the city, attacking not only public but also private buildings. 2 ER vehicles were destroyed. If we look at statistics since the beginning of events in Syria, we shall see that 34 doctors were killed, 42 paramedics were injured, a number of families were killed altogether. We've seen 24 hospitals and 84 polyclinics raided. About 200 ER vehicles were destroyed or damaged. Who are those people that fight against doctors? Until last year, in multi-confessional, multi-religious Syria, we haven't seen any cases of persecution or murders for religious grounds. Unfortunately, today this is not at all infrequent thing. Dozens of Christians became victims, and many of them have to flee the country where their ancestors lived for decades. Monasteries, temples are being shelled and destroyed. For instance, temple in Sydney, where they have an icon that was painted by Holy Luca. In the city of Zinar, where part of a belt of Virgin Mary was also raided. We hear from civilian population, from Russian people that live in the city, media that worked in very difficult conditions. We've heard about many cases that oppositionists persecute people that are in favor or loyal to Syrian authorities. Explosives were planted at their doorsteps. Their relatives were seized. They were asked for ransom. For obvious reasons, I'm not going to give you specific names of people or places. A few words about how those militants treat journalists. As a response for compassion, yesterday we learned about British journalist, Channel 4 News, Mr. Alex Thompson, who told himself about what happened to him in the Syrian city of Qusair, in the vicinity of Lebanon border. He visited the headquarters of the militants, and then with his driver, who was also his translator, and a number of other journalists, he was driving back. Armed revolutionaries or militants that were escorting him said goodbye and told him to go straight ahead, but they knew that he would actually become the target for the Syrian authorities, and the journalist is convinced that it was not coincidence that those militaries wanted him to be killed, to use this incident as propaganda against authorities. You can find this the story on the web. It really makes you learn the lesson. Of course, we all are in favor of greater freedom of speech, but when in the European Union and in the League of Arab States, authoritative decisions are taken to block broadcasts of Syrian public and private TV channels, that goes against the principle of the freedom of speech. One cannot but recall the bombings of the TV center in Belgrade and Tripoli, shelling of those TV centers, and we probably need to understand what the freedom of speech is and what should be done to respect this principle, not only domestically but also by the international community. And it's very important to ensure access to information, whatever the substance of the information is. And when Nuremberg Tribunal, UN decisions ban propaganda of fascism or Nazism, but then it is justified as a manifestation of freedom of speech, or where in similar situations, like what was happening in Belgrade or Tripoli, or what's currently happening with Syrian media, where different standards are applied altogether, we believe it is totally unacceptable. So, like I said, the facts I gave you probably show that responsibility for the current situation is to be borne not only by the Syrian government. Largely, the current situation is a result of actions of those that refuse to unwind funding of illegal groups, that recruit mercenaries, help them to cross the border, or play games with various extremists aiming at achieving their own geopolitical goals. Those goals are largely defined, as far as we can judge, by religious factors. We're seriously concerned with growing activity of international terrorist and extremist networks in Syria. By the way, talking about applying similar standards and notions of justice in different situations, I want to recall you that to justify need of interference from the outside, many often refer to the problem of refugees from Syria. Now, if you look at the statistics, according to the UN High Commission on Refugees data, number of refugees from Syria now amounts to about 80,000 people. Out of them, 28 Lebanon, Iran 25, Jordan 21.5, Turkey 25,000. Those people definitely need help and support. We hope that all refugee camps will open access to the UN experts from the UN High Commission on Refugees office, but the figure, about 80,000, will probably be growing, but we need to correlate that and put it in perspective with other figures. For instance, number of domestically, internally displaced people in Syria, according to assessments that we hear from different sources. Refugees from Iraq, there are about 1 million people that are currently in Syria, and about 500,000 of people from the Palestine. Has anyone ever thought of them? No one's ever cared, as far as I can recall. Refugees from those countries to Syria. I already gave the example of the former Yugoslavia. Does anyone remember about hundreds of thousands of Serbian refugees from Kosovo and East Slavonia? This is the major ethnic group of refugees in Europe, but no one's ever remembering them. But let's get back to Syria. We're satisfied with the fact that through huge efforts we managed to set up an international instrument to contribute to advancement towards peaceful settlement, referring to Kofi Annan's plan and supervision mission of the United Nations. They are working nonetheless. The plan is skidding. It was said at the UN Security Council with great concerns over the past few days. We're seeing no alternative to the implementation of the plan as means of achieving peaceful settlement. Peaceful settlement, I want to highlight that, and not force regime change by large-scale confrontation involving massive civilian casualties. Violence against civilians is unacceptable, so we need to make everything possible as our priority goal to put an end to this violence. Annan's plan makes it possible. Most importantly, it needs to be implemented in full by all players, including outside players. Thanks to that plan, on April 12, finally truce was achieved. Yes, it has been abused, but initially the level of violence started to drop. We've seen signs of stabilization of situation. Thousands of people that took arms previously laid using amnesty declared by Syrian authorities. A few hundreds of political prisoners and people that were previously detained for taking part in anti-government rallies were released, although new arrests do take place. We managed to Syrian authorities managed to agree with UN representatives on providing access to a number of humanitarian organizations to the most affected provinces in order to implement humanitarian emergency response plan of the UN that was also agreed upon with Damascus. We've seen serious advancement in terms of granting better access to international media. And finally, like I said, we managed to set up supervision mechanism on site. But first signs that are inspiring optimism that we've started seeing after April 12 was probably not fitting in the logic of those that are guided by the principle the worse the better, because what they want is the international community to become outraged and actually sanction intervention. We think this is the main reason why the Kofi Annan's plan is skidding. We think it is unacceptable. We want to have conversations with everyone and discuss with all those that are involved in the crisis and talk with them about what are the real reasons of the skidding and failures in implementation of the Kofi Annan's plan. Those failures are mostly results of lack of coordination of steps we're taking. What we need to understand whether this lack of coordination is explained by the absence of the forum for dialogue, or is it a policy aimed at disrupting settlement. We hope it's the first reason, that we lack open and sincere discussions, although the UN Security Council is there, but outside the UN Security Council there are other important players, League of Arab States, Turkey, Iran, neighboring countries of Syria, such as Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq. We need to get together somewhere so that on the basis of Kofi Annan's plan, the UN Security Council that endorsed the plan and mandated the UN mission, and in support of those most important documents, frankly and openly, looking into each other's eyes, agree that if on words we all welcomed Kofi Annan's plan, endorsed it, approved it by consensus in the UN Security Council, let us take active steps in practice, try to exercise influence on all Syrians without exceptions that are now at war, to make them stop and sit down at the table of negotiations. I'm convinced that if we show solidarity and will of all major outside players, we would be able to achieve our goal, and after that we would be able to immediately start political dialogue, of course on the basis of Kofi Annan's plan, which provides for the opposition the need to unite on the basis of readiness to engage in dialogue, and provides for the beginning of negotiations between the government and all groups of opposition. So on the basis of those assessments and ideas, we suggest that we start actively working on putting together an international conference on Syria. It should be a limited group of participants. The goal of the conference would be to contribute to implementation of Kofi Annan's plan and relevant UN Security Council resolutions. We need to get together all those that have influence on the daily development of the situation in Syria. We believe those should be 5 UN Security Council permanent members, Syrian neighboring countries, Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, representatives of the League of Arab States. By the way, Iraq is chairman of the League of Arab States at the moment. Qatar is president of the Committee of the League of Arab States on Syria. Saudi Arabia is the major country of the Gulf. It would also be important to invite them to join others at the table of negotiations, and such organizations as the UN. Of course, it should be held under the umbrella, within the framework of the UN activities. And I believe that the European Union should also be among participants that is also showing vivid interest towards the situation in Syria and steps to overcome the current crisis, as became obvious during our recent discussions during EU-Russia summit in St. Petersburg just a few days ago. Now, we want this conference to be a venue for frank and open dialogue that would make it clear whether it is realistic to find agreement on coordinated, consorted, targeted actions in relation both government and all groups of opposition.
And the sooner the better. If you ask me about the time about this conference, of course we can't just be united without further preliminary discussing all the aspects with the countries that we want to invite. Of course, we'll need some expert meetings, but now we are actively working with all our colleagues, partners, and we think, this is my last remark before I invite you to ask your questions, we think that it is crucially important to create such an informational background that would allow us to find the ways to stop the violence as quickly as possible and begin the political dialogue. If every day there would be calls to intervene forcibly with arms in Syrian affairs, if there are condemnations without no facts towards the regime, if there is no waiting for the results of an investigation which is done by the UN supervisors and the humanitarian agency, the Human Rights Council, and if they would every day say that if only Russia can say to Assad to step down, that will be all right, of course, with such actions we'll have no positive result. So the responsibility, it is the word which I'm pronouncing, and it, you know, may cause such great fires which you would not never put out. And the opposition now is convinced that it will be helped as in Libya. It shouldn't happen. So your questions, please. All right, first question from Russia 24 channel. Russia 24. Russia 24, Nikolai Vasilyev. Could you take a seat, please? You have just admitted, Mr. Lavrov, that all the achievements that were made within the six-point plan are in April and May. And for the last week, we have been witnessing new outbursts, massive outbursts of violence in Syria. And for the recent 2 days, the representatives of the different diplomatic countries of different states are discussing the military intervention and the prospects of voting that in the UN Security Council. About the position of Russia in the Federation Council, can we speak that this Kofi Annan plan is being intentively pushed to its failure? And whether those attempts would they have a success? Because there is a situation when, except Russia and Syria, no one is interested in having this plan implemented. Thank you. Well, in my introductory speech, I have said that we have an impression that there are some influential powers who would like Kofi Annan's plan to fail. But in order to prove the inability of Syrian leadership to cooperate for implementation of the document, and by that to justify the forcible intervention in the conflict, we see those attempts, and they are seen quite plainly. And to people who are not well dealt with the situation, it is difficult to see what really is behind those calls and claims. The UN Security Council would not authorize the military intervention. I haven't mentioned that. And I repeat that it is not because we protect Bashar Assad or his regime, but because we know how difficult is the religious composition of the Syrian government, of the Syrian people, and we know that those who want the military intervention, some of them want to break this religious composition and want to largely make Syria a military polygon of war to have the first place in the Islamic world. This is a very dangerous trend, and we will do everything to prevent such a scenario. And of course, when the Security Council has been called upon to authorize sanctions or actions on Chapter 7, which foresees measures up to forcible solution, we can't just go away from the situation in Libya, because there was one resolution, one consensus resolution. There was no veto for the second resolution, either Chinese or Russian, and both those resolutions were violated by practical actions of NATO, who did not implement them. Arms embargo was not fulfilled by those who supported the opposers. Our colleagues from Arab states and European states were open about that yes, they supplied arms to the opposers of the Gaddafi regime. Then why would they have to make this embargo running? So I repeat, we do not protect the regime, we protect the chances for stability in the region, for sustainability in the Islamic world, and we protect the international law. Because how Syrian crisis will be solved is very important for the world architecture in future, whether it will be based on the UN Charter or whether it will be seen as the right of the strong. BBC, please.
Steve Rosenberg, BBC News. Mr. Lavrov, you mentioned outside forces. Has Russia seen any evidence to suggest that the military operations of the Syrian opposition are being controlled or commanded by outside forces? And the second question, have Russia and America been discussing the possibility of a Yemeni scenario under which President Assad would step down and leave Syria? Thank you. If it would be possible to answer in English either now or at the end.
У нас шикарные переводчики.
We have wonderful interpreters. Well, you know, there is enough data that there are supplies to the armed opposition by arms and other necessary means of military means and information means. Syrian army is being helped by the information who is the head of the official army, who are the commanders of different groups in this army. Some of them are very disciplined, some of them are not, less coordinated. There is information that where is the headquarters of this Free Syrian Army, which countries help it financially, and these countries actually mention it quite openly. Our Saudi colleagues, our Qatar colleagues, yesterday in Istanbul there was a meeting of Syrian business people where they announced the organization of a fund to finance the Free Syrian Army. So this data exists. And I'm convinced that special services have more than enough of information. I mean, the special services of Britain as well, who have one of the highest grades. We are most praised in this field, and NATO as well. All the information is accessible, and we know that. And in private conversations, our colleagues show great information about what is happening. As far as the Yemen scenario is concerned, I would not like to go to simplified schemes, you know. Things are not too calm in Yemen now, though the plan of the going out from the crisis has been implemented. But the plan was about what we are speaking now. The Yemen parties sat at the table of talks and had an agreement. There were no preliminary conditions like, for example, from the very beginning, the president should step down. This was a result of an agreement. If Syrians themselves agree with each other about that, we will be glad to support such an end, such an outcome, just as many other states. But we cannot impose the conditions of a dialogue from outside. We think it is unacceptable, because that is not the way to sustainable solution of the problem. Syrians themselves should set their destiny and come to agreements, democratically, of course, by united people's voting, by popular vote. And the conference which we propose is for external players not to stay in the way of this process, because now some of them are in the way by making one of the sides, one of the parties, to continue the so-called, by inclining them to continue the so-called armed struggle until the international community has the military intervention. I'm now citing Burhan Galyun, the head of the Syrian National Council, who said we should continue the struggle till there is the external intervention. And the external players, as we see it, and as we would like to implement in our conference, which of course should be multi-stage, we should create maybe working mechanisms there if this idea will be supported. This conference should remove the negative influence of external players on the conflict and channel the will and the energy and the opportunities of the external players to assist, to contribute to the cessation of violence and bloodshed and the beginning of this general Syrian dialogue. This should be the conditions which we must create, and Syrians themselves should come to agreements because of them. Thank you. Russia Today, please. Russia Today, Irina Galushkina. I thought your microphone was green. I just was looking for the green color in the audience. No, just that one. In the Western mass media and expert circles recently, the topic of Russian arms shipments to Syria is being discussed. Many publications, for example, British publications, have this topic included. And according to these publications, this Russian weaponry helps to kill Syrian citizens. Do you have any facts that would allow to minimize the speculations of this sort? Or maybe just to oppose this lie, yes? I'll try. First of all, we do not supply to the Syrian government any arms that can be used, even at greater fantasy, against the opposers and manifestants. We just finish the contracts which have been for long signed and agreed upon.
These weapons can only be used if Syria ever is under attack from the outside. This is one and only type of arms that we're supplying. When first tribulations in Syria started, we decided, and it was a special decision, not to supply any light arms or any other types of arms that can be used to suppress opposition. By the way, certain countries of the Gulf, our US colleagues, are supplying exactly the type of arms that can be used against civilian population. Just recently, another such contract was signed. In addition to what I said already, I referred previously to Libyan experience. Well, arms embargo was put in place. No one was selling arms to government. Indeed, while the opposition was stuffed with arms and special troops were fighting on They've been treachery together with the militants. So it is yet another example of how it is important to be earnest. It's going to help you in the future. Sergei Viktorovich, you mentioned that armed terrorist groups have become proactive in committing their crimes and evil deeds lately. Thank God there were no casualties or victims in the attack against Russian civilians. Yesterday, electricity grids transformators were damaged in the vicinity of Damascus. Nonetheless, certain parties and countries say that they want to see Kofi Annan's plan implemented. Does all of that help to implement it? And my last question, lately we've heard many speculations and rumors saying that Russian position might change. Some believe that your recent initiatives to convene international conference, that Mr. Kofi Annan likes to refer to as the contact group, so many say that it is a signal, initial signal, that Russian position might be changing. So my question is, many Syrian people, or honest people in Arab Muslim states or elsewhere in the world want to hear from you once again. Are there any grounds for those rumors? And why have they started circulating those rumors now? In my opening remarks, I told you that there are no grounds to revisit our position whatsoever. If anyone considers that our initiative to convene an international conference is a sign of reconsidering the position, it means that those people just misunderstand our position. Our position is not just to sit and say, we're going to veto everything. We are active. We're really trying to find ways to advance, to move forward. That is why, back in the August last year, we came up with the draft statement of the UN Security Council President that was adopted. We were actually the first country that suggested that the Council look into the situation in Syria back last September. Then later on, we suggested, co-sponsored draft resolutions where we spoke about the need to exercise influence over all parties. Western partners refused to adopt such resolutions. We endorsed League of Arab States statement on November 2nd to send a mission of observers to Syria. We convinced Syrian authorities to accept the mission of observers. And that wasn't easy. Once again, Syrian authorities did make many mistakes. And many things that could change the situation for better were made way too late. So not only did we manage to convince them to accept the mission of observers from the League of Arab States, we tried to make sure that those observers would become more numerous, they would report to the UN Security Council. For some reason, Arab states did not want the report of the observers that they drafted a month after their return from Syria. They did not want the report to be presented to the UN Security Council. I have my guesses, but I don't want to say it without enough evidence. So we made it happen. Immediately after they reported, the League of Arab States pulled their mission out of there. The report, in my view, was rather objective. It pointed to the unacceptable steps made by Syrian authorities, but it also made it clear that authorities were not acting in a vacuum, that they were actually fighting against well-armed men. Maybe that was the reason why the observers were withdrawn. Maybe they were standing in someone's way, and that's probably what's happening now. We played an active part in appointing Kofi Annan's special envoy. We invited him to Moscow. We endorsed his ideas that later evolved into six-point proposal, and now we're doing the same old thing. We're convening this conference not to say Russia's changing its position. we want to convey to say we want to see six-point proposal implemented that was achieved via consensus. But I already illustrated the value of consensus on the example of arms embargo on Libya that was violated despite the fact that it was adopted by consensus. So we want to make sure that those that were in favor of Kofi Annan's proposal, that they were sincere. That's why we need this conference. If you like, it's a test for sincerity. Once again, by the way, we're saying it very openly and frankly, our conference, if colleagues agree, should become the only format of endorsing UN Security Council resolutions that supported Kofi Annan's plan. It's not a group of friends of Syria. That is basically a group of friends of the Syrian National Council and other opposition groups, including those that are
Оппозиционеры.
irreconcilable that act within Syria. What we're saying is that they need to agree within themselves. They need to be ready to dialogue, and that was the UN Security Council requested from them. Then why are we not responding when Mr. Galyun, who came from Moscow, we spoke with him, discussed in great detail, why is he requesting interference from outside, which goes against decisions of the UN Security Council and is against national dialogue, which is actually in line with the UN Security Council decisions? So if you have any doubts, I want to dissolve that. Moreover, I want to say that all those that wish to support Kofi Annan's plan must get together, get united within the framework of a conference, a contact group, or a conference might decide on setting up a contact group, but they must get united around the idea that is uniting all of us. And the group of Friends of Syria is incapable of doing so. And our position remains unchanged. It was reaffirmed once again during the recent visit of our President Vladimir Putin to China in joint statements that were adopted, and during the SCO summit that took place in Beijing on behalf of all members of the organization. So it remains valid, but it is not standing still, so the idea to convene conference is not taking us away from the idea, it's just the continuation. Please be brief in your questions. Good day, Sergei Viktorovich. 2 questions. Yesterday, negotiations with Mr. Hoff. Did you manage to obtain US agreement on such conference despite disagreements on Iran? And my second question, got information that Syria requested Russia and China and other states to investigate mass murders in Hul. Are you supporting the proposal? And do you think there's need for international investigation under the UN aegis of all murders in Hul and in Hama province? As regards consultations with Fred Hoff, my 2 deputies were meeting with Mr. Hoff, Mikhail Bogdanov and Gennady Gatilov, and they were not opposed to the ideas we tabled. Referring to the initiative to convene conference, we agreed to continue discussions. Yesterday I spoke about it with Kofi Annan's. You see, we want this event, this conference, to be productive. Now, to make it productive, we need to bring to the table all of those that have influence over different parties of Syrian conflict. And Iran is one of such parties. They do have influence over Syrian government, in this case, and saying that Iran does not belong there because they're to blame for everything and they're part of the problem rather than part of the solution, well, this would be too light-minded, to put it softly. You know, if we do serious diplomacy, Americans are very pragmatic. When they think it important, we turn a blind eye to ideological problems. Take Iran, when Americans needed to reduce level of threat for their own troops. They met with Iranians and found agreements. So this is normal pragmatic approach that is needed in foreign policy. But if that was acceptable to ensure safety of American soldiers in Iraq, why can't the same be done to ensure safety of Syrian citizens? Because inviting all those that have influence to take part in the conference is important if we want to send signal to all parties involved that there's need to put an end to violence. In both cases, we're talking about saving lives of people, so I hope there are not going to be any double standards applied in this case. As regards investigation, indeed, Syrian authorities suggested that Russia and China send their experts on site. We believe that the decision's already been taken, that UN mission supervision do the investigation, but the fact that they came to us with a proposal is a sign that Syrian authorities are prepared to allow international experts and to show them everything without trying to conceal anything. But we're not going to try, either us or Chinese are going to try to substitute for the UN mission that were tasked to do the investigation. Moreover, since we're already seeing signs that UN experts are going to be facing impediments, and if we look at what happened in Huland, at the ethnic composition of the region, once again, like I said before, Sunni Shia, there are also Alawites that live with Sunnis in close proximity. So as far as I understand, whenever the crisis is aggravated, there are more acts of violence, extremism, terrorism, those interreligious oppositions that used to be dormant, or less acute at peace times, they start to manifest themselves due to instigation from the outside. So investigation should be done by the UN experts, and I hope that those that have influence over the militants will demand them not to, that they don't stand on the way of investigations, like we demand the same from Syrian authorities. Al-Hayat newspaper, Sergei Viktorovich, recently we've heard about the need to amend or expand Kofi Annan's plan, given specific timelines for its implementation. What do you think about that proposal? As regards amending Kofi Annan's plan, I think it should be made more detailed. I don't think it's relevant any longer, quite to the contrary. All of its components remain relevant and important, but every point, especially those that talk about end of bloodshed and beginning of political dialogue, need to be made more specific. And this is one of the goals of the conference we're suggesting to convene. We need a mechanism to supervise and make sure whether all parties have stopped armed opposition, and to make sure that there's a mechanism to begin political dialogue. That should be discussed at the conference. As regards timelines of its implementation, once again, we're talking about an attempt to put an ultimatum, and not so well disguised attempts, because people want to say we rest our case, we don't want to extend the mandate of the Kofi Annan's mission, and then the international community will be outraged and vote in a correct way in the UN Security Council, and it's easy to read those signals. Once again, I referred already to the experience of observers sent by the League of Arab States that were revoked in just a month. What is it one could do in a month? Nonetheless, they managed to achieve certain results, and we needed to build on the progress, all the more since Syrians were ready to accept an unlimited number of observers. By the way, there were more observers then than there are UN supervisors now, about 1,000 people. So, but for the decision of the League of Arab States to revoke observers without any clear reason, we would have had for a long time in place a broad presence of international community in Syria, covering almost all areas. And then League of Arab States observers could be enforced by observers of the United Nations, and not only. That was another mistake. So one needs to be conscious of the fact that a number of similar decisions were taken. As soon as there was any hope that the situation would appease, such a decision would be taken. That leads us to believe that from the onset, some of our foreign partners were guided by the principle, the worse, the better. The sooner it happens, the sooner we're going to get grounds for armed intervention. So now we need to make sure that Kofi Annan's plan is not destined to fail likewise by a number of capitals, but imposing artificial timelines. That's never efficient, ever. Is there a timeline for Palestinian settlement? No. Why? Because everyone understands how difficult it is. Why should we treat Syria differently? Or be less considerate in our approach? Sergei Viktorovich, the voice of Russia.
On the verge of situation in Syria was discussed by Kofi Annan and Hillary Clinton, and besides Syria and the international community, the plan also was discussed, a strategy of the transition of political power. Does that mean that for the Western countries the transition of power is a solved matter? Well, this is one of the main contradictions, in content. As far as I understand, this was expressed by the American side on the results of the meeting with Kofi Annan. Kofi Annan himself is basing on the thought that the Syrians themselves should come to agreements. Well, it's actually what I heard from him when I spoke with him yesterday by the phone. So we agree that external players should not impose any schemes to the Syrian parties, but should create the conditions for them to begin agreeing themselves. We have to make them go to the table of negotiations, while first stopping the armed violence. Several minutes ago I said that this conference is not to preset the parameters of the political settlement, but to create the conditions for Syrians to do that themselves and to push them to continue talks. Just the same thing we do towards the Arab-Israel-Palestinian-Israel settlement and for other crisis situations where the international community acts on the basis of the commonly accepted principle that the parties should deal with that themselves. The Nagorno-Karabakh problem is the same. The co-chairs of the Minsk group make the conditions for the parties to find the solutions themselves. That is how we must act in all the cases, including Syria. Two more questions. Al-Arabia. I'd like to go back to Kofi Annan's plan and the situation on the results. So for several weeks, the Annan's plan is being implemented. There were many talks, many meetings at the international level, but still there's no result. Do you think that this international meeting really can push the Annan's plan forward, or do you just get those parties together because the Annan's plan is in the deadlock? Well, I understand that you follow your addition policy. Everyone should make that. No, I do not think that the implementation of the Kofi Annan's plan has failed. I don't think so. And I repeat that the conference is for making the plan be implemented throughout the coordinated actions of the external players on influencing the Syrian sides to stop violence and get at talks and speak to each other. I would not say that the Kofi Annan's plan is not implemented in any of their points, as our colleagues prefer to say, by raise tensions. That is just a bright phrase for an unsophisticated observer, but you know, short phrases are always remembered. If you say Kofi Annan's plan is not implemented in any points, that just gets into the heads and then becomes a common idea. The first point, you remember that it says about the necessity to work with the team of Kofi Annan in order to have a political process begun. We have these contacts. Kofi Annan is satisfied with them. No obstacles for his team to have a conversation. Well, maybe the content of these contacts is yet still not very satisfying, but the process is a process. By the way, the head of the UN mission, Norwegian General Muth, remarks in his reports to the UN Security Council that the Syrian authorities are cooperating with him and are giving the assistance which they are committed to give. As far as the end of the military actions point is concerned and the truce, at the beginning, after the 12th of April, Syrian armies were really withdrawing from the towns. They were criticized that they were not withdrawing far away, but they, judged from the experience of the last autumn, as according to the plan of the Arab League, they were just pulling out their contingent from the towns, and the towns were immediately taken over by military opposers. And this experience, of course, by the way, is another confirmation that we need a mechanism which would allow non-militarization of cities after government troops left them. That's what we have to think about. There we have the space for the international community to act. But when the Syrian army is losing about 30 people each day, I do not think these are peaceful opposers who are attacking the soldiers. These are armed opposition groups. And I gave you the facts today. So that means that the opposition does not fulfill the point which makes it stop the violence, and neither is the government. But we mustn't say that if only the government makes the cessation of armed violence, then will be all right, because in that case, immediately armed opposition takes the regions. We know perfectly which cities are controlled by the militants. About the humanitarian assistance, there was a special point about that. Recently, the talks of the Syrian authorities with the UN representatives were finished, and there was a document signed about 7 humanitarian bodies of the UN entering to Syria. There was a humanitarian forum on Syria with the participants of Syrian government. There were funds allocated to that, and the humanitarian assistance is being rendered. About peaceful demonstrations and demonstrants that were detained, hundreds of people were set free. Of course, there were new arrests, but saying that nothing has been done is wrong. You know, this is for people who would not like to go into details and who like to get just simple slogans from the screens and in the internet. Well, and as far as the mass media access is concerned, we have been recommending that to the Syrian government for a very long time, to open the borders for journalists. The authorities were claiming about the biasedness of the journalists. Well, of course, there are biased journalists in any channels. For example, in Al Jazeera, we know such cases, but we kept convincing and are still convincing the Syrian authorities that most journalists know their reputation and will be proficient and professional in their work. Well, of course, something is not fully implemented, it is late, etc. But after this plan has been taken, the number of journalists in Syria has grown significantly. Of course, they do not always receive the long-term visas, but again, to say that nothing has been done is wrong. I just gave those examples because we should not use only the gloomy paint to draw this picture on just one side. Thank you. Commissant. Sergei Viktorovich, I'd like to make it clear. Those regional and Western players who act on the principle the worse the better and want the military intervention, what do they want really? Economical, political benefits, or just is there only the religious basis for that? What are their intentions? You know, I can't make guesses about what they want. I may say what our views are about what can be the result of that. This can result in deep violation of stability, which has already been seriously undermined in that region, and the consequences would be unpredictable and influential for many countries in the region. And the heart of this process will be the break inside the Islamic world between Sunni and Shia. I hope that this is not what those parties who have the strict position in changing the regime of Syria, I hope that's not what they want. Well, these are our estimates. I can speak about them only. So our estimates say that such a scenario is possible if we do not take any coordinated steps together to influence all the parties in the conflict in order for them to stop warring and make talks. Dear colleagues, I apologize for the questions that haven't been yet asked, but I hope our communication will continue. Go around the world with us and you will more opportunity to have communication with us about this problem. Thank you.